really excited about this topic. It's a little bit different than what we have been focusing on. And then next week we'll be talking a lot more about a particular case study of wild animals in Kenya. So it's a good preparation for that conversation. I want to remind you about this particular sort of blue circle that we talked about weeks ago. And in the blue circle, you'll remember part of what we're doing when we're thinking about this is to try to justify why it is that we can draw those lines, right? So why we might think that my nation takes precedent, that people from my nation take precedent, or that we're morally justified in giving greater consideration to people who are in my nation than people in the rest of the world. And what I want to focus on today is this line, the line that would be between human animals and other animals, or non-human animals, to try to figure out what kinds of ethical arguments could be given for drawing that line, and then to see what problems there are with those kinds of arguments. And then we'll look a little bit more into questions about what would happen if that line couldn't be justified, in the sense that we can't really make an ethical distinction between humans and other animals, which is a pretty wild idea, but that's what I want to try to do today. So the notion that we can think about human animals, all human animals, as separate from all other animals is often called human exceptionalism. And there's better or worse ways of arguing for this view. So I want to share with you a bit of philosophical work that's been done to try to draw that line, again in the blue circle, between humans and other animals. So one way of thinking about it is that we might say that some being X deserves consideration from some agent A, like us, all of us in the class. Who are we to say? We, in class, it's us, A's. If and only if, that's not a typo, right? If and only if that particular individual is a member of our species. This is a view that's called speciesism. And it's generally thought that this kind of view, that I should only pay attention to my species, is not justifiable. And that's because species membership itself is not philosophically or ethically interesting, right? That I am a Homo sapien as opposed to an aardvark doesn't really matter from an ethical point of view. There's all sorts of other arguments, and we'll need to talk about those, about what counts as a species, whether species itself is a fixed notion or not a fixed notion. But the idea here is that species doesn't give you any morally relevant reason for caring more about humans rather than non-humans. That you're born one kind of animal as opposed to another kind of animal, in other words, isn't itself an ethically interesting feature of you. But there's another way of thinking about the view that I'm calling human exceptionalism that is a little bit more of a justification that's not based in some kind of arbitrary biological or quasi-biological category like species. And that's this, what I'm calling this anthropocentric view. Now, there's a lot of words, and we're going to be having a lot of words because we're going to go through arguments today. But the idea here is essentially that a being, again, X is a being, deserves moral consideration from us, agents, who are thinking about these questions, if and only if they have certain characteristics that we have. And so the idea that's typically given, that comes out of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, is that I am a rational agent. My rational agency gives me is a morally relevant capacity that I have. It's what allows me to make decisions. It's what allows me to reflect on decisions. It's what allows me to decide whether to act one way or another way. And that's morally relevant. Species is not relevant. But my ability to reason and to think through various kinds of options, to take classes like this, to read novels, to write novels, this is something particularly unique and special about human beings. And I have a couple of quotes from Kant here. I did want to focus a little bit on Chris Korsgaard at the third quote. What she suggests, and I think it's really powerful, is that there's something so unique about our rationality that it itself provides the very source of normativity. Because we're rational, because we can decide how to act, because we can endorse a certain kind of action that we perform, we ourselves are able to create ethics. That's what ethics is. So it's a source of as rationality is a source of normativity, and part of what makes humans special is that we have these fundamentally normative capacities, and insofar as we have these capacities, we could draw that line. We could draw the line around that separates humans from other animals. But you might be thinking, wait a minute, do all humans have that capacity? And that is a worry. Because what we're trying to do, again, is justify that line between the human and the non-human, which would suggest that we would have a way of separating all humans from all other animals. But is it true that all humans have the capacity to reason about their actions, to reflect on whether or not they have reasons to act one way or another way, and then ultimately to endorse the deliberative choices that they've made? Well, no. There's lots of people who don't do that. Infants, for example, human infants don't do that. Children don't do that. People who have perhaps forgotten how to do that. So there's a sense in which this category, although important, may not include all and only humans. The way of getting around that for some philosophers has been to think about it in terms of potentiality. So another way we might think of this is that a being deserves moral consideration, that is, they count in the blue circle, if they are a rational agent or a potential rational agent. So they will become a rational agent. And we can think of that with infants and children. They will become rational agents if everything goes okay. And some people have even argued that it needn't even be potentiality. It could actually just be that you stand in a particular relationship to rationality. You used to be rational, so you count. Or typical beings that are human are rational. So you stand in that relation to rationality. And that is part of the reason why humans, we might say, are separate from other animals. Okay, so this is an interesting view. Humans are beings who are responsible for their actions, so whether they act responsibly or not, they have the capacity to be responsible, so that's why we might accept it. Humans can reciprocate in ways that other beings allegedly can't, can return favors, can keep promises and make promises and keep those promises. Humans are capable of altruism. Humans are able to be appealed to with persuasion and reason, usually, mostly, some people not so much, but usually and mostly reason and persuasion works for people. And so I want us to think, though, if all of this is really true for all and only humans. So take out your clicker and let's see. What you think. Is this true for all and only humans? It's all now this big category of reason standing in reason. I wonder what you're thinking about this. Oh, sorry, A and B. Sorry, yes and no. Sorry, that got changed. Yeah, A, yes, B, no. Okay. Let's see what we do. Okay, so most of you think no. And it's kind of moving around. That's cool. How did that work? I probably didn't stop A. Yep, I didn't stop A. Here we go. Okay, so, and I wonder if the reason that you think no is because there are other animals that might share these capacities. Yes? Raise your hand if you thought that might be true. Right. And I think we have a lot of reason to think that that might be the case, and I want to turn now to some of those reasons. So some of you might recognize these non-human beings, non-human animals. Alex the parrot, who's no longer with us. Alex knew various kinds of things, worked with Irene Pepperberg, knew all sorts of things like how to count, what kinds of colors things were made of, what kind of materials things were made of. This image here is an image from the 1930s. It's of a chimpanzee infant named Bois and a human infant named Donald. And back in the 1930s, they did some pretty weird things. This human infant was actually Donald Kellogg, was the son of the researcher, Dr. Kellogg, who at one point what he was trying to do was figure out whether or not chimpanzees and humans' developmental stages were different. And people didn't know that much about chimpanzees in the early part of the last century. But there was one part of this experiment that I've always liked to share. He had a bunch of children from the neighborhood and chimpanzee Bois sitting on a bench, stood behind the bench, and shot off a gun to see who reacted first. And these are little kids, right? So it was a very interesting experiment. What he ended up finding out is that chimpanzees have certain capacities that are more advanced at an early age, and children develop obviously greater capacities later. This is a series of experiments about mirror self-recognition in dolphins, and you can see this isn't actually David Attenborough in the mirror. He's behind the mirror, but you can see him here. There's been some experiments that have been happening at the University of Chicago about rat empathy. Has anybody heard of these experiments on rat empathy? So what happens in these experiments here is that a rat is put into that plexiglass tube, and another rat is left free, and the rat is offered a choice between getting some chocolate or yogurt raisins, which rats really like, or letting out their friend from the tube, and to a very high degree, far above chance, the rats will choose to let the friend out of the tube rather than take this high value treat. So that's a really interesting set of experiments. And I wanted to just show you a video. This is based on this capuchin, of a really interesting test on equity aversion or inequity aversion. Can you hear it?
So this a very famous study of this now. Many more, because after we did this about 10 years.
This is researcher Franz de Waal.
We did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs and with birds and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group, they know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber, and there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is a monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. So he gives a rock to us now. Gets again cucumber.
Can you get the front lights off? Yeah.
She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So one of the things that that we see is that there is a tremendous amount of cognitive and emotional and social capacity that other animals are able to display. And so this is a just a chart. It's slightly outdated. This is certainly my former postdoc put together. And basically what this is attempting to show is that there are a series of capacities here, like sentience, which we're going to talk more about in a moment, anxiety, self-recognition, self-awareness, autonomic memory. That's the memory. It's a type of consciousness that allows an individual to sort of construct their identity by putting together thoughts about things that happened to them in the past. Theory of mind, which is the ability to understand that other individuals have thoughts and desires and attitudes and preferences that are distinct from one's own. And full biographical consciousness is this idea that one exists as part of a larger network, their families, their relatives, their sort of maybe ancestral histories and all of that. And so what Robert did was he looked at all the literature to see how to answer what kinds of animals might be said to have these kinds of capacities. And this has changed a little. I think one of the things that's most exciting and what we're now finding out is that sort of mollusk is a pretty weird category, but if anybody has paid any attention to octopuses lately, of course, we now know that octopuses, which are cephalopods, as we talked about, or I mentioned before, are able to experience things that and solve social puzzles in ways that we didn't really think they could. Also, although there's some debate about it, it does look like fish also feel pain, which is also something new. That was something you might have said no to just 10 years ago. So what we've learned from this kind of research over time is that many different kinds of animals can use tools, and they manipulate their environments in a variety of ways. That's not particularly surprising given that they have to exist in those environments, but they also solve social problems, and I think that's an important feature that people weren't really paying a whole lot of attention to. In order to make it in the world, in social groups, you have to be able to figure out what other beings are thinking or doing or feeling, whatever you want to call it, in order to make your way and not be in conflict all the time. And sometimes you need to imitate them, sometimes you need to cooperate with them, sometimes you might need to manipulate or deceive them, and many animals are able to do that. As I mentioned, some animals are thought to have a theory of mind, and there's been a series of really interesting pieces of research that have shown that chimpanzees, for example, are able to they will act quite distinctly if they can see that a dominant chimpanzee sees something or doesn't see something. So for example, if there's a piece of banana in the middle of enclosure and a dominant chimpanzee can see that piece of that banana, then a subordinate chimpanzee will not go to try to get the banana. But if you occlude that, if the dominant chimpanzee can't see the banana, the subordinate chimpanzee will consistently get the banana. And I'm saying that, but bananas, like grapes, are really high value food items for chimpanzees. So the subordinate really would want the banana, but wouldn't want the conflict that would come about if the dominant chimpanzee were to see the subordinate chimpanzee get the banana. Some of them use symbols, as we saw with Alex, and there's a number of chimpanzees and other animals, including sea lions, that are able to manipulate symbols. They're emotional beings. We just saw that they respond to injustice, perhaps, or betrayal. So they're like us in these morally relevant ways. And perhaps more particularly, they are able to suffer both psychologically and physically. So that is one of the most important pieces of sort of information, if you will, from an ethical point of view. I just want to tell you what these images are. Were you wondering? So this is chimpanzee Emma, and it may look like Emma is using this wrench to open the hydraulic gate, but actually what she was doing here was just imitating somebody who had just fixed that. Emma's a chimpanzee I've known since she was a real youngster, and she's really quite clever, but she wasn't clever enough to get herself out of the enclosure. Okay, so I want to turn now to a set of arguments that are not Kantian, that are not based on rationality, which is one way that you might be able to distinguish humans from other animals, but rather are based on this idea that animals suffer. So you don't need a variety of high-level cognitive capacities to see that you might need to include all those beings who can suffer. And this is the argument that Peter Singer famously made. And it's an argument that basically suggests that if you are really genuinely committed to equality from an ethical point of view, you cannot deny the interests and experiences and suffering of other animals who can suffer, right? And so the idea then is that if you're going to try to be consistent and to make sure that your ethical perspective is one that's defensible, insofar as pain and the avoidance of pain matters to you, matters to your friends, matters to your kid's sister, matters to your parents, it also matters to any being that can experience pain. It would be arbitrary, in other words, to say, well, it matters to humans, but doesn't matter to animals, given that both animals and humans are able to experience pain. So the idea then is that sentience is this capacity to suffer and experience pain, and what Singer suggests is that all sentient beings have an interest in their welfare. Okay, now there's different ways of thinking about that, which we don't need to worry too much about, but you don't have to develop a full-blown interest in the sense that, for example, I know I should really take vitamins because vitamins are in my interest, and it will probably enhance my well-being if I take my vitamin. It's not that kind of interest. It's basically an interest in avoiding pain, and we see this in their behavior, right? So the idea then, again, is simply that all those who suffer does not, if you're concerned about pain and suffering and welfare and well-being, you cannot draw that line that we were talking about around all and only human beings, because there's going to be other animals that are going to matter. Now I want to get into that a little bit deeper, this idea of equality. Yeah?
Why can you then draw that line around all and only animals? Does a sponge experience more suffering than a plant? Plants clearly want to defend themselves, I would imagine, because they suffer, so.
Well, so part of what's going on in Singer's argument is that he's actually looking at particular kinds of organisms. So what I was just saying a minute ago about, not having to imagine this complicated idea about, taking my vitamins. It's not that kind of interest. It's an interest in avoiding pain and suffering. And what Singer argues is that we can see that animals will move away from noxious stimuli. But when forests are on fire, the trees aren't running. And so what he wants to say, this is his view, is that insofar as sentience is a basic concern, and he goes back to this idea here that we think it's really important to avoid pain, and we will avoid pain. We are prejudicial when we don't also recognize other animals as wanting to avoid pain. And he says we don't see that in ecosystems, we don't see that in trees, we don't see that in plants. If there was a way of showing that plants did feel pain, then I think they would count, right? I just don't think that evidence is clear in the way that it is with other animals. Does that make sense?
I would be inclined to disagree, but it does make sense, yeah.
Right, insofar as once the evidence is available, if you could show, for example, if there were creatures from other planets which we don't know they exist or not, we don't have evidence that they exist, but if they feel pain and pleasure, they would count too. That's the idea. Is what we know, going back to the last slide, we know that a whole range of animals feel pleasure and pain. We now know fish feel pain. We know octopus feel pain, things we might not have known 10 years ago. And insofar as we can show more beings that are sentient, that's what matters. But right now, I think that the consensus is that it's a wide range of animals, but it doesn't go beyond that. So it's not excluding necessarily other sentient beings. It's just saying wherever that line of sentience goes. Okay, so I want you to just take a minute, and I want to think about this idea of equality. And I want you to just take a minute to talk to each other about what's wrong with things like racism and sexism. Now, I'm not asking you to sort of talk generally about this, but I'm just specifically from an ethical point of view. How would you object to racism and sexism? Just take a couple minutes. Go. Okay, do you have some thoughts that you would like to share? Anybody? What's wrong with it? Yes?
I think in a lot of cases when someone is like racist or sexist, they ultimately see the other individual as less of a person. And I think that perspective is really flawed.
Right, okay, so there's a way in which there's a mistake that's being made about the valuable qualities of the being that's being the target of that judgment. Other thoughts?
Racism and sexism both require choosing a characteristic by which to judge the value of somebody or to separate people. And we were thinking it's probably ethically tricky to justify choosing one criterion over another.
Okay, I think that is definitely, it's always ethically tricky to choose one criterion over another. These particular characteristics, though, again, I think we could argue are probably just irrelevant, right? Now, there's a sense in which, and I think this notion of moral irrelevance is very important, but there's a sense in which sometimes race as a characteristic or gender as a characteristic is relevant, and that's going to largely depend on the context. So, for example, if I'm directing a play and it's a play about the life and times of Malcolm X, it would be really weird if I decided to cast Angelina Jolie in the role of Malcolm X, right? That would be weird. That would be peculiar. I mean, it could be some sort of artsy play, but the idea is that there's a relevant reason in that case, a historical reason, a reason to maybe be true to a biography that would mean that we would want to focus on gender and race in that context. So there's cases in which it's tricky, it may be relevant, but there's cases in which it's morally irrelevant, and I think that's what we're getting to with the justification earlier. Any other thoughts about what's wrong with it? From an ethical point of view? So one of the other reasons that I think there's something wrong with it is that there's actually a kind of a social ill that emerges when you have those kinds of morally irrelevant distinctions that are made socially. You lose out as a society. It's not just the individuals, but there's a larger harm or wrong that might be done. So the idea then, and this just gets back to this notion that I was trying to talk about in terms of equal consideration that Singer raises, is that when you want to think and treat others equally, when you want to consider them equally, what you need to be doing is to be focusing on what matters in a particular context, okay? You're going to take their interests into account, but there may be contexts in which those interests would be weighted differently. But to deny that those interests are equally relevant is prejudicial. That's the idea, that it's prejudicial, and it's based on morally irrelevant prejudice. So part of what Singer argues is that can be applied to the notion of other species, that racism and sexism is akin to speciesism, or our exclusion of other animals that can suffer, or other, let's just say other beings, going back to the earlier, other beings that can suffer, right? Now, importantly, I just want to highlight equal consideration, that is paying attention to the equal interests or equal claims of all of those who have interests, is very, very different than treating people equally. And we'll say a little bit more about this in the next, when we start to talk about more about environmental justice. But the idea here is that we're not going to imagine that we're going to treat everyone the same. We can't imagine treating everyone the same. If we were to treat everyone the same and think of that as equal, we would end up potentially harming a variety of individuals or violating their interests. So part of the reason that's true is because even though we're considering the equal interests of beings who can suffer, we're not going to be thinking that they're all beings suffer in exactly the same ways. Okay, so that's the important point that I think we need to just take on board. Now I want to look very specifically at the argument that Singer raises. So this is the argument that he raises. And I want to really focus your attention on this. It's a very straightforward argument in some ways, but this is the kind of argument that ethicists make. And I want you to think about how it might be that you might object to this argument, if you do. So what Singer says is that an act is right when it minimizes suffering and promotes welfare. That's the utilitarian, or what we can think of as consequentialist view for our purposes, because utilitarian can often mean different things in an economics literature and the philosophical literature. So the idea is what we're trying to do is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. We could call that utility, but it needn't be utility. And then we should give equal consideration to the suffering of all animals or all beings who can suffer. So this is this principle of equality that we were just talking about, or the anti-speciesist premise. Now, what Singer has us realize is that many of our policies and practices cause much more suffering than well-being when you compare it. And he does think you can compare these things, right? And so he thinks then that this, we can see this in things like factory farming, the testing of animals for cosmetic use, for example. These are the kinds of cases in which we are causing more suffering than pleasure that we're gaining. And now again, we can't discount animals' pleasures and pains just because they're animals. That would be prejudicial. Okay? So what he thinks is that our policies and practices involving non-human animals are wrong. Many of them are wrong because of this set of arguments. Well, two quick questions. What might that mean in terms of our own practices? Any thoughts? If this argument was compelling, what would that mean?
We're more
moral obligation to not eat meat?
Yeah, it looks like it, or at least certain kinds of meat, right? With that there's a moral reason and a moral obligation to not at least eat factory farming animals. That would probably be right. Okay.
Human civilization is based on morally reprehensible practices.
So, I mean, that's sort of maybe even, if you look at it, I don't know, it sort of looks like that if you look at sort of the history of slavery or whatever else, right? I mean, that seems like, that may come out of this, but it seems like it's probably something that would come even before we thought about considering animals, potentially, yeah.
I actually have a question.
What?
So you're saying that it would make it morally wrong to eat animals raised in a factory farming setting, but why would that be different from any sort of animal? Because by killing an animal, it's already more suffering than welfare.
Good.
So why would that be different?
So that's a really good question. Yeah, do you want to answer it?
Yeah, I would say that the reason is because that the animal would be suffering during its lifetime. Whereas, like, of course, no animal would want to die, but because an animal that is living entirely within a factory is suffering for the entire existence of its life, then it's morally more excusable to eat an animal that has been raised on a farm and had a happy existence because it has been raised under better circumstances.
That might be the argument.
Yeah, well, this is kind of interesting point, because wouldn't that then make raising an animal on a farm that or ethical factory farming or raising animals in ethical ways to be killed, wouldn't that then be more moral than allowing animals to be eaten in the wild? I'm not actually trying to argue that we should go out and kill all the lions, but I mean.
Oh, did you see these slides? You saw these slides, didn't you? How did you get there? Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. So wait 1 second, you jumped right ahead. So the idea is that you might think, before we get to that particular objection, which I think is a really important one, what I think is just to get it clear on this idea of what the implications of this are. It seems that there are going to be clear-cut cases. Factory farming is the kind of practice that is sort of over-determined in terms of its harmfulness, not just to animals, but to the environment in terms of climate, greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of pollution, in terms of waste, in terms of water use, in terms of health risks. So in that sense, it's an easier case than the case of painlessly killing an animal that lived a natural life, right? I think that's what we need to get clear about. The details of the argument in the particulars, we don't have time to get into in class here, but I think that what I'm hoping that you'll understand about this argument is that there are clear cases, then there are cases that are a little bit more fuzzy, but the idea is that if you can see that the harms well outweigh the benefits, from an ethical point of view, from a consequentialist point of view, when you're taking the interests of all into consideration equally, you get a situation in which many of our institutional practices need to be challenged or are ethically unjustified. And that's one of them, right? Now, when it gets to the other questions, there might be more that we can say. Any other objections or worries about this particular argument or concerns that you want to raise? The idea is, and this is what I'm hoping you'll take away, is that the idea is that if you are going to be consistent and think that it is wrong to harm each other, it's very difficult to figure out why it wouldn't be similarly wrong to harm other animals who also have interest in not suffering. Right? That's part of it. Now, you already saw, what do we do when the interests in not suffering conflict? So this is a really tricky kind of question. And so one of the ideas is that maybe if what you're really worried about is to try to prevent suffering, that we need to go out into the wild and try to prevent suffering. Now, this is not a very plausible way of thinking about these kinds of problems. And part of the reason it's not plausible is because there is a vast amount of suffering in the natural world. And so it would be a particularly endless process to try to minimize that suffering. Now, Singer himself has and many others have responded to the worry that if you're opposed to suffering, you need to somehow go out and stop it by ending predation. So the idea is, in some philosophical fantasy, if you can create it so that lions are vegetarians, like zebras are vegetarians, that maybe that's what you should try to promote. And with genetic modification, maybe we can. And the question there, I think, is what many have argued is maybe that's a little bit too arrogant on the part of humans who have pretty much messed things up as we've gone along. So maybe that's a little bit risky. And it wouldn't be a great idea to actually do that. Some people have also proposed pretty outlandish things, like, for example, maybe what you should do is when you see a situation like this and the zebra isn't successful in fending off the lion, that you have sharpshooters out in the savannah and they can painlessly shoot the zebra so that they're not eaten alive, because that's what happens. That seems like, what would you say about that? Well, I think even a utilitarian or a consequentialist could say something like, that's probably not the most sort of pleasure-producing use of our resources, right? But it does raise a series of questions. And this lets me turn to even deeper questions that move us into this discussion about what to think about individual suffering versus what to think about species suffering altogether. So I wanted to just present a case. This is the Galapagos Island case. And basically what had happened in the Galapagos Islands is that over a series of generations, invasive animals had been on, and islands are particularly fragile ecosystems and raise pretty intractable problems when it comes to invasive species. So in this particular case, pirates, they say, and farmers and others had brought goats and pigs and donkeys to the islands. And what was happening is that the animals were overgrazing the island, and the native species, including these tortoises, were becoming threatened. And so what they decided to do, which is quite remarkable, is to bring on a very expensive, highly trained group of sharpshooters, and they eradicated the goats and the pigs and the donkeys from the islands. They killed them by hunting them. They killed them from aerial helicopters. And then they introduced what they called Judas goats, goats that were chemically induced to be in estrus to attract some of the stray goats who had managed to escape the hunters. And these particular Judas goats were had GPS tracking devices. So they were they attracted these other goats because of the hormonal and pheromones that they were emitting, and then that led to a way of killing off the remaining goats. And so they eradicated 250,000 goats and some pigs and donkeys as well. And this particular eradication project proved very successful, and invasive species and the destruction of those species was eliminating them from the island, led to a regrowth of native plants, and increased the well-being of the native animals as well. So this is a particularly interesting case of not just individual interests in conflict, but whole groups or species in conflict. And so I want to spend just a couple minutes thinking about that. But before we get there, I want to do one more of these. So is there something ethically problematic about what I talked about, the Judas goats? Okay, so here is, there's nothing wrong. It's a clever way to eliminate invasive animals. Yes, this is making them betray their conspecifics and it's against their will. Yes, it's turning animals into mere instruments. Yes, I'm not sure why, I just think it's weird. there's nothing wrong because it's a clever way of getting rid of these invasive animals, is about equal with it's turning animals into mere instruments of human destruction, and then making them do something against their will and finding it weird are about equal there too. I think it's a really interesting question, and one of the things I want to do in the last couple minutes that we have is to think about why someone, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but why some people might think that there are certain values at stake that would make it both a good way of getting rid of invasive species, and also why there are good reasons of thinking that this is actually a way of turning animals into our own instruments of destruction. So there's different kinds of ways of thinking about the value of species. And I just wanted to identify a few. Again, this will tie us back to our discussion about instrumental versus intrinsic value. There are all sorts of important ways of thinking about the instrumental value of species. There is a whole bunch of scientific knowledge that we can get from them. They're biologically important. They help us understand in certain ways how the ecosystem is stable or unstable. We've talked a little bit about the way in which they can be indicators of ecological health. There's also medical value in many, many species. Obviously, there's economic value, aesthetic value, and recreational value, which is also to some extent could be economic value. And then there's this other, so there's a lot of ways that we can think about why it is that the native species in the Galapagos had more value from an instrumental perspective than in these invasive species, and we might be able to weigh out those instrumental values in a utilitarian calculus that leads us to say, for example, this was a clever way of getting rid of invasive species, and certainly that's what the conservationists who are involved in the killing of these animals would. But there's also a fundamental question about the value of those animals' lives that were taken. And if we're thinking about intrinsic value of these animals and their ability to feel pleasure and their ability to feel pain, then whether or not they're invasive shouldn't really matter. So that's partly why I think thinking of them as instruments would also make it a problem. I just want to give us one other set of ethical issues before I let you go. One of the things that's really a difficult question, and we'll be thinking about, I hope, next week, is does this value of a species derive from the values of individuals? Or is that to say that the value of the species is made up of the sort of welfare values of each member of the species? Or is there something specific to the species itself that's valuable? There's also a problem of how to trade off values, just when we're thinking about at the level of trading off individual values, what to do with the predator and prey relation. There's a really tricky set of ethical questions about how to trade off large species values, like, for example, jobs versus owls, or in the case of zoos, is it okay to take some gorillas or other endangered species and force them into captivity in order to, quote unquote, potentially save the species? And I think there's another question that I just want to raise for now before I let go. Are all endangered species equally valuable? And I think that's a really interesting and hard question. We tend to think of polar bears, elephants, as we'll see next week, as particularly valuable. We tend not to think of little things that are ugly as so valuable. So these are some of the questions that